Chapter 2, Mishnah 10. We learned in the previous Mishnah that if something is growing in a flower pot that has no hole in its bottom, the plant is not considered attached to the ground, and it can therefore become tame. Our Mishnah takes this a step further. Before a food can become subject to tuma, it must first be prepared for tuma, receive hechsher by becoming wet. Hechsher, however, takes effect only on something that is no longer attached to the ground. Thus, our Mishnah will teach below that if a fruit or vegetable is growing in a flower pot with no hole in it, and it becomes wet, it has received its hechsher and can now become tame, since it is not considered attached to the ground. However, if it is growing inside a flower pot with a hole in it, the fruit or vegetable does not receive its hechsher when it becomes wet, because it is considered attached to the ground. The Mishnah begins by discussing an exception to this rule. Utensils without holes in them that are nevertheless considered open to the ground. So the Mishnah begins by discussing an exception to this rule. Utensils without holes in them that are nevertheless considered open to the ground. Okay. And we now turn to the words of the Mishnah. Utensils made of dung and unbaked clay that are soft enough for the roots of a plant to be able to push their way out through them do not make the plants growing in them prepared for tuma. That is, they prevent the plants growing in them from becoming prepared for tuma even if they become wet. Although a plant growing in a pot without a hole usually does become prepared for tuma when it becomes wet, plants growing inside pots made of dung or unbaked clay do not become prepared for tuma. This is because we look at these pots as if they have a hole in them, and the plant in them is therefore considered attached to the ground. Thus, these pots do not make the plants growing in them prepared for tuma. The Mishnah now teaches the basic rule of hechsher that applies to things growing in a flower pot. A flower pot that has a hole in it does not make the plants growing in it prepared for tuma. A plant growing in such a flower pot is treated as if it is attached directly to the ground. Accordingly, hechsher cannot take effect on anything growing in this flower pot. But a flower pot that does not have a hole in it does make the plants growing in it prepared for tuma. Since a plant growing in a flower pot without a hole does not draw nourishment from the ground, it is not considered attached to the ground. Therefore, it can become prepared for tuma when it becomes wet, like any other fruit or vegetable that is no longer attached to the ground. The Mishnah teaches the size a hole must be to allow a plant to be considered attached to the ground. What is the minimum size a hole in a flower pot must be in order for the plant in it to be considered attached to the ground? It must be large enough for a small root to go out through it. The Mishnah teaches about another case where a plant growing in a flower pot without any hole is nonetheless considered attached to the ground. If a flower pot with no hole in it was filled with soil up to its rim, and it is like a flat board that has no rim around it. If more soil is added on top of the flower pot, forming a mound that rises above the sides of the flower pot, it has the same law as soil piled on a flat board with no rim. Since the soil on top is exposed to the open air on all four sides, a plant that grows in it is able to draw nourishment from the ground through the air. It is therefore considered attached to the ground, even though the flower pot itself has no hole.